So welcome to the ITF Special Academic Lecture Session. My name is Gwenan Chen, Team Lead of Innovation and Policy Analyst at the ITF. And I will be your moderator today for this session. This new initiative aims to foster academic discussion and share knowledge on critical transport issues, bringing together experts from around the globe. And we are thrilled to launch this series with our first lecture today. A brief introduction about the ITF, or International Transport Forum, for the ones who are not very familiar in the list. So ITF is an intergovernmental organization with 69 member countries that acts as a think tank for global transport policy. The ITF facilitates the exchange of insights and ideas to improve transport worldwide. And we are delighted to have you join us for this insightful session on enhancing freight transport connectivity through analytical frameworks, applications to Central and Southeast Asia. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Ruth Banomyong. Professor Ruth Banomyong is the chairman of the advisory board to the Thai Minister of Commerce and also a former dean at Thammasat Business School, Thammasat University, Thailand. He holds a PhD in international logistics from Cardiff Business School and serves on the boards of the Port Authority of Thailand and Thailand's Eastern Economic Corridor Development Zone. Professor Banomyong has received numerous awards, including James Cooper Cup, Supply Chain, Asia's Educator of the Year, and IEOM Distinguished Educator Award. His research interests include multimodal transport, international logistics, trade facilitation, and humanitarian supply chains. He has published over 100 papers and co-authored more than 10 books. Since 1995, he has been a consultant for many international agencies, such as UNCTAD, UNESCAP, the World Bank, ADB, ASEAN, and OECD, ITF, of course. So today's topic is particularly relevant as we explore the critical role of the freight transport connectivity in driving economic development, especially in the dynamic regions of Central and Southeast Asia. With global and regional initiatives and ASEAN connectivity plans, this lecture promises to be valuable for offering the insights. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Ruth Banomyong. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gwenan, and apologies for coming in a few minutes late. Was having a few logistical issues, but allow me to share to the audience, in fact, the work that I have been doing with the ITF team, and I think I also need to thank the other two contributors of the two other papers, Alan McKinnon and Jesper, who are doing different things, but at the end of the day, all of this is interrelated. So for my topic today, I will talk about the publication or the research, the report that we have done related to enhancing freight transport connectivity through analytical framework. And the key word here is connectivity. As you know, connectivity is a word that is used quite a lot. It has been used quite a lot over the past 5 years, 10 years, but there's still, I would say, some confusion in terms of what, at the end of the day, connectivity entails. So as part of this presentation, this short lecture, I will give you a brief introduction, but then we'll delve into this issue of the definition of connectivity, because for many people, connectivity has a different meaning. And because here we are specifically looking at freight connectivity, I would like to talk about the conceptual model that I have worked on and further developed for this particular report in terms of how can we actually look at freight connectivity, because at the end of the day, after the explanation of the concept, we need to be able to measure connectivity. And this is really the key contribution of the work in terms of how can we actually assess connectivity, where are the gaps, and what level of connectivity are we talking about. And in this presentation, I will share with you a number of tools, frameworks that have been highlighted in the report that can be used to reflect connectivity, be it the macro freight connectivity scorecard, the multimodal transport cost and time model, the ITF's own non-urban freight model, and then last but not the least, the border performance index. And then I'll finish off with some ideas in terms of policy measures. But of course, these policy measures need to be based on some sort of an analytical framework so that decision can be based on actual data and not just based on feelings. And then I'll finish off the presentation. So in terms of the introduction and as a starting point, yes, it's true. We talk a lot about connectivity, and we do understand that connectivity supports economic growth, supports supply chain efficiency, supports resilience within the supply chain. And when you look down another level, focusing specifically on freight connectivity, well, it's all about this capability to be able to move goods both within and across borders. And from this perspective, because in this particular work, we basically looked at two specific regions, which is Central Asia and Southeast Asia. As you know, Central Asia, there are a lot of landlocked countries, but it can play a very important role, especially in terms of the revival of the Silk Road, and it can become an economic corridor that is able to connect East Asia with Western Europe by land. Then the second geographical area that we're looking at, it's Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, yes, well connected to the rest of the world. We have one of the biggest ports. So the maritime connectivity is very strong in the region, but now you also have opportunities, especially with the new Lao-China Railway, to link also to the Silk Road and also go to Western Europe, via land transport. So for this presentation, what I would like to do is just to give an overall methodological framework. Of course, in the report itself, there's a lot more detail. So I will just give you a snapshot, a quick snapshot of what we have in the report that can be used to assess connectivity along the various freight corridors, be it in Central Asia, be it in Southeast Asia. So let's first start with the definition itself. So when we talk about the definition, and I think it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise because there's no universal definition of connectivity. And like I was saying a few moments ago, it really depends on which perspective you're looking at. However, as part of this work, of course, we need to go into the literature and say, okay, what are some of the definitions that are out there? And I found one definition, which I think is quite good, where basically it says, yes, connectivity is the availability of transport that enables people and goods to reach a range of destinations at a reasonable generalized cost. Yes, because if the cost is high, then connectivity doesn't really happen. So you need to understand connectivity by looking at this interaction between cost, the time it takes, the reliability of the network itself. And when we talk about connectivity, again, another question is, what types of connectivities do we have? There are many different types of connectivities that we can have, and this is just an example, just to share with you. There is this term that appears in the document, which is institutional connectivity. And some people may say, but what is institutional connectivity? It's really all about what I call the software, the rules, regulation, bilateral agreement, trilateral agreement, regional agreement, multilateral agreement that exists and that are there to facilitate cooperation, coordination among various agencies within different countries, region, and it's all about this coordination so that you do not have gaps in terms of the rules and regulation. Because when you start having different rules and regulation across region, across countries, that is not an enabler of connectivity. In fact, it is the total opposite. In the literature, Angelopoulos also stated that we can look at connectivity from three main dimensions. One is the physical connectivity, and I think that's the one that people tend to understand the most. It's the easiest one to grasp because we're really actually talking about infrastructure, road, rail, airport, seaports. So this is what we do understand and we do see because it's something we see every day. And now today we talk about virtual connectivity, where virtual connectivity is part of this digital infrastructure that enables the flow of information, that enables interaction between agencies, between people, both within the countries and across borders. And last but not the least, you have social connectivity. And in social connectivity, it's about groups of people having common interests and then mingling among each other so that they have this sense of community, have a similar perspective, and then are willing to do things together. So as you see here from the definition of connectivity, it can be quite daunting because you don't have just one definition, and it really depends on which perspective you are looking for. For us in this particular publication, we're specifically looking at freight connectivity. So what is freight connectivity? Well, it's basically this, the efficiency, the efficacy of the infrastructure and services that facilitates the movement of goods across various transport modes, both within and between countries. So it's a relatively narrow definition. And the idea behind enabling freight connectivity is to be able to reduce costs, transportation costs, reduce the transit time, while at the same time increasing reliability. And these are, I would say, basic dimension when we talk about performance of networks, performance of transport system. It's all about how this system, if you use them, you are able to reduce the cost, reduce the time, while at the same time increasing the reliability itself. And when we try to conceptualize freight connectivity, this is what I would like to say, is that for me, freight connectivity, at the end of the day, is really how you aggregate four interrelated dimensions. So that means in freight connectivity, we will have four dimensions. First dimension is infrastructure. Second dimension is the institutional framework, or the institutional connectivity that I was referring to a few moments ago, service providers, and then the shippers and the consignees, the owners of the freight. And how I conceptualize this freight connectivity is through this particular model, where in the middle you have the objective, which is the regional freight connectivity. But regional freight connectivity will depend on the capability of the infrastructure. Regional freight connectivity will depend on the institutional framework itself. So if I were to explain it in a bit simpler term, infrastructure is a bit like the hardware. This is a computer I'm using. This is a laptop I'm using. This is the hardware. Then the institutional framework is a Zoom program that I'm using to share this presentation. And the service provider, well, it's basically me here, who is giving the talk, giving the lecture, trying to explain this particular report. And then you have the shippers, the consignees, where in this case, it's the audience that are listening. And how well the connectivity is will depend on, one, the quality of the infrastructure, two, the harmonization of the various institutional frameworks, rules, regulation, agreements. Three, the service provider, it's the capability to use the hardware under the constraints of the regulation in order to meet the requirements and the need of the cargo owner themselves. So as you see here, this overall conceptual model helps us in better visualizing and understanding what affects, what impacts regional connectivity. So from a connectivity challenge perspective, and not surprisingly, we tend to think very often about the infrastructure issue, because that's one of the most tangible ones. The second one that we think about are the regulatory barriers, rules, regulation, and this is quite often coupled with border crossing inefficiencies, where you have infrastructure problem, but also rules and regulation problem. Another challenge when we talk about freight connectivity is we're not taking a unimodal perspective, but we're looking at it from a multimodal perspective, where the focus is really on door-to-door transport. From the first mile to the last mile, what are the various modes of transport that can be utilized in order to provide these door-to-door services? Technology becomes an issue because not all the countries in the world are at the same level in terms of technology. We also have the issue of financing. And quite often, this is what I say infrastructure is not a problem as long as you have the money. But quite often, when the money comes, there's quite a number of strings that are attached to it. And this is where we see that there are a number of geopolitical issues that affects, that impacts connectivity. And last but not the least, today we need to talk about it, is all these environmental issue, the sustainability issue, because very often transport logistics is considered, is seen as one of the biggest culprits in terms of emission, CO2 emission in the world. I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying that, yes, this is an issue that has arrived, and we also need to consider these issues when we look at it from a connectivity perspective. So how do we assess connectivity? There's basically 3 levels that we can look at when we're trying to assess connectivity. The first one is the macro level connectivity. And in terms of the macro level connectivity, this is what I can say is that I did not invent anything new. When I went through the literature, I noticed that there were, in fact, really a lot of indexes that are out there. We have the Globalization Index, Connectness Index by DHL, KOF Index of Globalization, Global Connectivity Index, Connectors Index, Liner Shipping Connectivity Index, Logistics Performance Index, Air Connect. So there's a lot. There's really a lot of macro level connectivity indexes that are published either by international organizations, both public and private. And then I noticed that apart from the macro level connectivity, you also have operational connectivity indicators, as sustainable connectivity, multimodal transport, intermodal transport, corridor performance measurement, border performance, cost time distance model, time release studies. So this basically tells us that if we want to understand connectivity, we need to also understand from which level we are looking at. Are we looking at the big picture, macro level? Are we looking at it from an operational perspective? And in fact, the choice of index or methodology to assess the connectivity will basically depend on what is the aspect of connectivity that you are looking at, that you want to measure, that you want to improve. And this list, I would say, is not exhaustive. I'm sure there's a lot of other indexes. I think maybe sometime now we're struggling because we're being submerged by all of those various indexes. It's about picking the right one that suits the objective in terms of what do we actually want to do when we're looking at connectivity. So in terms of connectivity gaps, and this is what I would like to say, is that it is quite self-evident. We talk about deficiencies in the infrastructure. We talk about shortcomings from a technological perspective. We talk about barriers from a regulatory policy perspective. And then you also have operational inefficiencies, for example, at the border, at specific terminals. And something that we do see quite often is this issue of coordination among the various stakeholders. Very often, when we try to look at trade and transport facilitation, we always notice that the first thing is this issue of coordination among the various stakeholders. Certain regions that are very far away, accessibility may be limited for them. The capacity of the network itself can be an issue. And yes, again, last but not the least, environmental and sustainability issue, which at the end of the day, if we have more and more regulation, that may negatively impact the freight connectivity that is supposed to happen if we have too much regulation. So it's about this balancing act between sustainability, efficiency, effectiveness, cost, time, and reliability. So here are the three different levels that we can use to measure the connectivity gap. The first one is the macro level, where we take an holistic picture and we use a number of indicators to reflect where are the gaps from a connectivity perspective. Then the meso level looks at it more from a corridor perspective, where we're looking at it from the perspective of one origin in one country and one destination in another country. And last but not the least, a micro level, where here we really focus very much on a very specific link, which are the border crossings, which are the intermodal terminals, where we look at the capability, the connectivity capability at that specific level. So if you were to look at the macro level, and here again, you see the model, the conceptual model, but the difference here is that you have a number of indicators. You have a number of indicators for each of the dimension: infrastructure, institutional framework, traders, manufacturers, shippers, consignees, service providers. And if you notice, well, these are, I would say, widely published indicators, such as from the World Bank Logistics Performance Index, the World Economic Forum Competitiveness Report, and there's also some for specific modes of transport, like the IATA Air Connectivity Index, the UNCTAD's Liner Shipping Connectivity Index, or even the DHL Global Connectedness Index. However, the indicators that you have in these four dimensions just shows us one part of the picture, and the ITF itself has a model that looks at regional freight connectivity itself, which is basically a percentage of the global GDP accessible from one country. And I do suggest people to go and try to find a bit more in terms of the work done by the ITF related to this regional freight connectivity index, which of course will be improved over time, because as you all know, all of this is an iterative process. So this is an example just to show you how you can use this macro level scorecard. And I've just taken an example. Let's say we're trying to look at the connectivity between Malaysia, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, Laos, PDR, and Vietnam, and then looking at the scores. So these percentage come from the transformation of some of the actual scores, but just to show to you, and I think it's quite evident that when you see this, this table, if one were to look at the freight connectivity between Malaysia and Thailand, for example, not a lot of issues because they are relatively at the same level. However, if you imagine a shipment from Malaysia through Thailand, through Laos PDR into Vietnam, you notice that Laos PDR, as one of the country in the middle, the connectivity performance, the score is relatively low. And that says to us that there is an issue with connectivity. It's based on this principle of the weakest link. That means that in supply chain management, the capability of the weakest link reflects the overall performance of the system. So the challenge here is how can we help improve Laos PDR's score so that at least they can be on par with its neighboring country to enable freight connectivity at the macro level to happen. So this is one example of how we can use this macro level freight connectivity model. Then you have at the meso level, and this is where I would like to share with you and present to you this Banomyong-Beresford multimodal transport cost model. This model should be used together with the macro level freight connectivity scorecard because it will look at specific corridors. It will look at the performance of specific corridors, be it domestic, be it international. And in terms of the data needed, not so much. Origin and destination of the cargo, the routing itself, and also indication of places where the cargo is not moving, such as at the border or at various terminals, the mode of transport for each leg, the distance involved in each leg, the transit time for each leg, and we must not forget the cost of the quotes for each leg. And on the right-hand side, what you see is this model and how this model can be used. So here in this particular figure, you see the concepts behind the model itself. So if you look at A, that's really the basic transport economic model where we are looking at the competition between, for example, here, road and rail. And we are all very familiar that over a certain distance, rail is more competitive. However, when you look at how transport is being done today, especially door-to-door transport, you end up having a combination of transport modes. And in the model, it shows that, for example, if you go to an inland terminal, a rail freight terminal, what will happen is that the goods will not be moving, but of course the cost will increase. That's a B figure. The cost will increase because you have some lift on, lift off, and then the goods are put onto the rail and then transported. And you notice that, oh, road plus rail, combined transport, at the end of the day, it's more expensive than just rail, but at least it is still less expensive than just using road transport. And then you have the combined transport, road, rail, sea. But the last part is the most important one, which is really what we want to do with this specific model is to reflect from origin to destination, what happens along the way, be it from a perspective of the change of transport mode, but also at the border crossing themselves. So on the horizontal axis, you have the distance. On the vertical axis, you have the cost. What is also good with this model, and it's flexible enough, is that you can replace the vertical axis with the time it takes. So this is a very simple illustration, but in fact, a very powerful illustration of what is happening within a corridor. Another model that you can use for the meso perspective is this non-urban freight model, which is a multimodal network model that has been developed by the ITF, and it's really looking at the various freight flows, and these freight flows are assigned to specific routes, modes, and network links. And then because it's a global model, so you have the domestic data, you have the domestic model, you have the regional, and then you have the global, and the current version looks at the freight transport activity for 19 commodities on a global scale. And this is a picture, conceptual model of the non-urban freight model that has been developed by the ITF. And in fact, as part of the work that we're all doing, it's also about improving this model so that it is more precise. And the output we'll have is in terms of transport demand, but also from a transport emission perspective. Last tool, but still not the least, is this micro level assessment with the BPI. And I think for many of you, you might not be familiar because this is a relatively new tool. We are specifically in the BPI looking at the efficiency and effectiveness of border processes, especially at the border crossing itself. So we're looking at border performance, such as the speed of custom clearance, the ease of transporting goods, the overall regulatory environment that affects traders that are doing import, export, cross-border trade. So this is what we're looking at within the BPI. And from this, I'm going to show you a conceptual model where in the BPI, it looks at 4 dimensions, which is very similar to the macro level, but we're doing it at the micro level. Infrastructure, institutional, importer, exporter, freight cargo owners, logistics transport providers, and then we have drilled down to the border level, and it is used to measure the border performance. If you're interested in the methodology, very quickly, it uses an approach that is similar to the LPI, which basically asks the perception of those that are involved in border crossing. So a bit more details. Yes, what kind of scales we use? Well, in fact, we've taken them from the OECD trade facilitation indicators, and it's a scale of from 0 to 2. So that means for each dimension, you will get assigned different scores. And then depending on the score you get, you will be either considered a high performer, a consistent performer, or a partial performer. What you need to remember is that if your score is less than 1, that means there is an issue, a big issue. If you're 1, that means so-so. But if you're closer to 2, then that means you are your border performance is quite well. And this is just an example of how we've used the tool at 9 specific border crossings done in my country in Thailand. And we did this benchmarking within the group. And we were able to say that which border area, which border post performed better than the others. And then there were some lessons learned that were shared between the various borders so that at the end of the day, the overall border performance improved. Because in theory, you should not have any difference in terms of border performance. But here it shows that there are issues in many countries. So from a policy perspective, hard measures, yes, like I said, it's quite easy. As long as you have the money, just going to the transport, infrastructure development, transport network expansion. But you also need to look at some of these other type of logistics-related facilities, such as dry ports, intermodal terminals, logistics parks and hub, the infrastructure improvement at the border, information technology infrastructure, and even the investment in fleet modernization can also help in terms of reducing some of the costs. If you look at it from the soft side, regulatory reforms is usually first on the list: harmonization of standards, simplification of custom procedures, and enhancement of cross-border cooperation. I do understand that sometimes when we look at the European model, like the Schengen model, where there's no borders inside the EU, this might sound a bit going back in time, but in fact, the majority of the world, we still have issues at the border. And that is why we need to look at it both from a infrastructure, hard perspective, but also from a soft perspective in order to facilitate the movement of goods, people, vehicle across border. So just to conclude, this is what we have tried to do in this particular report is one, provide a comprehensive definition of connectivity, but also showing that you cannot do just infrastructure on its own or rules and regulation on its own. It needs to be aligned. It's like the hardware and the software needs to be aligned, and collaborative approaches are very, very important, especially at the border areas and future focus area, looking at sustainability, technology. These are things that we need to look at. And of course, if we're able to use this tool to monitor and evaluate certain regional activities, I think we'll get a better picture of freight connectivity and how do we assess it and what is the impact and outcome of freight connectivity. So with this, I think I would like to end my presentation. I think I took a bit too much time, but hopefully it was interesting and you have the context. So my name was on the first slide, but here you have the whole ITF team that were involved with me in this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Banomyong, for this enlightening lecture. Please go ahead and stop sharing the screen if you wish, so that people can see you. We now have about roughly 10 minutes for our Q&A session. So I encourage our audience to ask questions using either the chat box or the Q&A function. So why don't I start first to sort of set an example for for our audience? So, Professor, you mentioned the importance of both hard and soft policy measures in enhancing freight transport connectivity. So I wonder if you could provide an example of a country or a region where this combination of the measures have been very effective and led to the significant improvements.
Well, I can give you an example of what has happened where they did not combine.
Sure,
Okay.
that sounds good
Sure.
as well.
Okay, so let me just share with you this story because I was involved in this also. So Thailand has a number of neighboring countries, and one of the neighboring countries is Laos, which I just referred to a few moments ago. When the decision was made to build a second bridge to link the two countries, because we have a river that crosses, the Mekong River, we receive Japanese funding to build the new bridge. It's called the Friendship Bridge, the second Friendship Bridge. And yeah, the Japanese were very efficient with Japanese funding. They built the bridge, in fact, and they were able to finish ahead of time, which is a big surprise for infrastructure project because no delays at all. The problem was because they finished before time, Thailand and Laos did not have the time yet to talk in terms and to negotiate, to discuss in terms of the modalities on how to actually use a bridge. So the situation was that the bridge was finished, but no one could use it. Yeah, you could see a few stray dogs walking on the bridge because you had to wait for the soft side. You had to wait for the two parties to agree, how are we going to actually use the bridge? What are the modalities? So this is an example where you have the infrastructure that is finished before, but you cannot use that infrastructure because the software is not in place. So that's one example that has happened. Another example, again, that happened to me, it's with Myanmar, Thailand and Myanmar. There was this mega project in Myanmar called Dawai. That's called Dawai, and it was a Thai investor that received the concession to build a mega port. So the Thai government and the Myanmar government at the time agreed that at particular location at the border, this will be the official border crossing, international border crossing. So that was the soft side being ready. Yes, this is now an official border crossing. But what was the problem? There was no facilities at the borders. Right? There was no facilities at the border. And it took more than, if I'm not mistaken, 3 years until the borders facilities were completed. And you know what the worst part is? The border facilities that were completed was only on the Thai side. Remember, at the border, you have two sides. So on the Myanmar side, it wasn't built because they didn't have the funding. So you ended up having, yes, the software, the agreement that this is going to be the official border crossing. Goods could go in transit. You could do many things, not like a provincial border crossing, but really this is an actual official border crossing. You, at the end of the day, had part of the infrastructure, but then it still didn't work because you didn't have the corresponding facilities on the other side. So I think this is an example of where infrastructure and the soft side, when they are not aligned, it creates problem. Maybe one example that I would say I have seen of infrastructure being aligned with the soft side, but some of you may say it's not really an issue. But if you look at the border crossing between Hong Kong and China, what is fascinating is you cross the border in a building. They are in the same building, and everything is facilitated. So, just going through, you don't see any difference, and the rules and regulation are harmonized. Even something as simple as the opening hours and closing hours. These are very simple things that when we think about it, it shouldn't be an issue, but that is not true. It is an issue. And all of these things needs to be harmonized, and that enables the flow of people, the flow of goods, the flow of merchandise between the two regions.
Great, thank you very much. Indeed, both hard and soft measures needs to work in hand in order to really make things work. So perhaps my last question to you is on this institutional framework that you highlighted. You highlighted many challenges are there in terms of implementing this institutional framework for freight connectivity. What would you say the immediate steps that governments need to take action in order to streamline this regulations and improve cross-border transport efficiency?
For me, I would say that the most important thing before any new rules, regulation, or whatever is being proposed is we need to have a baseline assessment. What is actually happening on the ground? If you don't have that data, you might be just dealing with the symptoms and not really addressing the root cause of the issue. So you need to have this data, you need to have this work being done so that you have the baseline. And from the baseline, there you can identify the issues. If those issues are infrastructure, then you deal with them. If those issues are regulatory, then you need to look at, is there an issue from a harmonization perspective? Is it an issue of implementation? Very often what we see is an issue of implementation. The countries have agreed, but at the border level, they're still a bit confused because they still don't know how to actually implement the agreement itself that is, in theory, supposed to facilitate freight. But then because they don't really know what is happening, trade is in fact not facilitated. So that would be my first advice. And even though a country may have a national trade and transport facilitation committee, at the implementation level, at the borders, you need to have these joint borders trade and transport facilitation committee in place, because it's all about the execution. It's all about the capability to be able to comply with the broader agreement.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we have one question also coming from the audience. It's about the geographical differences between these countries. So due to the geographical differences, the dependency on each transport mode also differs from country to country. So is it possible to eliminate the country characteristics in the assessment to evaluate the connectivities of the countries, just to see the actual capacity of connectivity?
Okay, so yes, you're very right. Geographical differences, even the level of economic development does affect the connectivity itself. There is, and it is possible to measure just connectivity on its own by taking off these constraints. And in fact, I would suggest to that person to look at the ITF Regional Connectivity Index, because it's looking at market to market on a broader perspective. So it is possible to do. However, if you want to have more granularity, then sure, then that's why you have to take into account the various physical constraints, the level of economic development, the level of technology that there is. But if you want to have like a global overview, I would say that the ITF's Regional Connectivity Index can give you this overall connectivity, but on a higher level.
Thank you very much, Professor Banomyong, and thank you very much the audience for the question. Given the time constraints, so I think we will wrap up this successful lecture here. Thank you very much again, Professor Banomyong, for your insightful response to the questions and enlightening slides presentations. So on behalf of the ITF, I extend our gratitude to Professor Ruth Banomyong for his time and expertise. And I also thank our audience for their active participation. So before we conclude, I'm pleased to announce that our next lecture in the ITF Special Academic Lecture Series will be on enhancing freight transport decarbonization through analytical framework. So it's one of the series of this work. So looking at the decarbonization of the freight transport by Professor Alan McKinnon on the 9th of January. Oh, sorry, 9th of July. My bad. So I will pop in this registration link here for everyone. So looking forward to also welcoming you to join the next lecture series and provide your feedback and suggestions for the future topics. Thank you to the organizers and our technical team for making this event possible, and we hope you found today's lecture enriching. Have a great day or great evening, depending on where you are. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. See you soon, Agvinan.
Thank you, Professor. Bye.
Bye-bye.